Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Ask GN. As always, leave your questions in the comments below, but quick note here, there's a new rule, I guess we'll call it. Because there are so many questions on these videos now, I'm still reading every single comment for Ask GN videos, but it would help me tremendously if you could upvote and downvote the comments with questions that you think deserve most to be answered. I'm still going to go through all of them, so it'll be as democratic as possible, but it just will make my job a lot easier because then I'll immediately know, okay, this is what people are interested in this week. So please do that. I got to get the cat hair off the table. We've got a video on OCAT that just went up, working on more of it, so that's still in flux. But let's start off with the Ask GN content. So for the first question, we've got one from Covenant11, who says, Dear GN, what is it about Crysis 3 that keeps benchmark junkies using it as a benchmark even as we approach the 4-year anniversary of its release? What features and options is it about the engine that keeps this game pushing the hardware? Crysis is definitely abusive in a lot of ways in terms of visual effects and geometry, all kinds of stuff in their tessellation. So that's one reason. We don't really use it. I know that at least a couple outlets use it for maximum power load testing, staring at a skybox. I test power draw a different way, but it does put a lot of strain on the GPU, on the system in total. So for a couple of reasons, it's good to keep around old games. If you worked on Crysis years ago when it came out and you've worked on it since then, it's not a bad thing to keep around. And the same is true for us with Metro Last Light, with, in the past, Grid Autosport. That lived on our benchmarks for years, and a couple of other games as well. Shadow of Mordor. Some people sometimes will ask, why did you guys waste your time benchmarking Shadow of Mordor or Metro Last Light? No one plays them. That's not really the point. We benchmark games like GTA, Battlefield, Gears of War, whatever happens to be new, so that you can see what the performance is on a game that you play. But games like Metro and Shadow of Mordor, we keep around so we have a look backwards in time, and that can be used later for really important things. For example, let's say we wanted to do a driver benchmark where we're looking at how do the drivers impact performance of these cards, maybe the 700 and the 200 series cards, over the period of 3 years or whatever it may be. We can do that with Metro Last Light and Shadow of Mordor because I've already got all that data. I don't have to sit there and pull drivers from 3 years ago and rerun it all. We have all the data on the same platforms even. So that's pretty useful. Now, it's also useful because with these games, two more reasons. One, they're never updated, so you don't have to worry about a sudden game patch like with Doom just requiring that you rerun all tests, which really sucks. But it's important to do because when a patch comes out and it increases and changes performance, obviously you can't recycle your old data. We talked about this in a previous video. But, or you could, but you shouldn't if you're comparing new data with it. So we try to keep the data the same age as much as possible, and using older games helps with that, and mix in a few newer games that are popular at the time. Now, another reason you would use Crysis 3 as a benchmark is because Crysis 3, or for us, Metro Last Light, both games, we know very well where a particular card should fall on the chart based on just sort of intuition with benchmarking all the other cards. So if I know this card has X shaders, X CUDA cores or stream processors, whatever, has X shaders and it has Y memory and it has Z, whatever else, clock rate, I know it should fall between these three cards. So that's a really powerful tool for benchmarking and for figuring out rapidly if your numbers look good, because, more cat hair, if the numbers don't look good, we just shot a video with Snowflake on the table, because if the numbers don't look good, you want to find out immediately. That way you're not wasting your time running through all the other benchmarks. So that's probably why some outlets still use Crysis 3. I never jumped on it when it was new because we weren't really doing that yet. But Metro is kind of my equivalent of Crysis 3, and then Shadow of Mordor is in there as well, though we've kind of moved away from that recently. Next question is Obzen, who says, do you think the price of MLC and TLC NAND will continue to rise into 2017 and beyond? Prices keep climbing with no end in sight, it seems. So this is a topic that comes up pretty much every 2 years, and it's normally with RAM, but kind of in the same boat with SSDs. It's just SSDs are more visible now than they used to be. This is not something I've studied as closely as other outlets, and I'll give a shout out here. Tom's Hardware has probably the best article on these SSD NAND prices. I'm not going to go ahead and try and compete with them. You can just check their article on that for information. If you search Tom's Hardware SSD NAND prices, I'm sure it'll be top result. So what they were saying, and all of this I agree with, is that adoption in mobile, in notebook, and in desktop is at an all-time high for NAND. And if you don't know what NAND is, we have a video on it that explains what it is, has animations and everything. But basically, because one, prices were lower than ever for SSDs, and two, in notebooks and laptops, you can decrease the size, you get a smaller form factor, you decrease the power consumption pretty considerably, considering what's actually in there and how it's already low power consumption. A hard drive, 2.5-inch drive, even at 5 volts, is still drawing a decent amount of power compared to the rest of the components when an SSD might be a watt or less if it's idle. So that's a big reason. And I guess, speed, of course. So because of these things, and because SSDs have kind of proven themselves in the market now, there's a lot more people buying them for desktop, but there's a tremendous amount of NAND being used in phones right now, and NAND being used in just flash memory being used in notebooks, basically every Mac notebook, and a good deal of Windows or Linux or whatever, any other notebook out there, but especially Apple right now. So with that, your prices are going to go up, and I don't have an end in sight. I'm sorry. So Tom's talks about it a bit more. You can read more there for information. Next question is Arellano, aka Helgaiden, I suppose, who says, what's the oldest processor you have lying around, and what did it come out of? Where did it come from? I still have one from my first PC, a Pentium MMX 233, and it's funny to look at now compared to current stuff. First to note, we did a tour of the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California. You should definitely search for a Computer History Museum on our channel, because I was joined by Jim Vincent, who is, for all intents and purposes, a computer historian. He's been in this industry for eons, and he's been programming since the start. So he talks in that video about some really old processors, and that's kind of fun. We go through like the Cray supercomputer era and before it even. The oldest stuff I have an X386 system somewhere in an attic, but the oldest one that's actually accessible and ready to use would probably be a Pentium 4 from around, I want to say 2004 maybe, somewhere in 2003 to 2005 area. And that processor I keep around because it was to my knowledge, the first consumer available hyper-threaded CPU. There might have been one other one, but I think that was the first one, at least that was in my price range at the time. So that is a Pentium 4 something. I don't have the model number. Hyper-threaded, so it was the first poor man's dual core, basically, that was really available. And I think from memory, it had quite a few issues at launch, but I think they kind of smoothed it over. It was an interesting time. That was not far off from when AMD put out their Athlon 64, which just recently I reread the review on Anantech about the 64-bit the Athlon 64, because it's actually a really critical point in history. I didn't know a lot about it because I wasn't really into the detailed part of computers at that point, so I wanted to reread it and learn from a historical perspective what it did. It's a good article. You should read it if you haven't. But yeah, my oldest one's probably a Pentium 4 with hyper-threading. And I don't know, it's a P-series chipset, I think. Still got the system, too. It was in an Antec Landboy, maybe. Not the Landboy Air that came out in the last few years, but a Landboy, the silver one with the blue plastic grill thing on the front and the tray in it that held screws. So if you ever tipped it upside down, it would dump all the screws into your case and short something. That was the case it was in. Next question, Tech Pascal, who says, thanks again for answering my previous question. My new question is, how are games optimized, and what determines if a game is poorly optimized? For example, Ark Survival barely runs at 60 frames per second on my Titan XP at 1080p max settings. That's really, I have not tested that game. That's impressive in some ways, I guess. Is this due to poor optimization of the game, or is the game that graphically demanding? How can you tell? A few things. So on the graphics side, a lot of optimization, most optimization happens at the developer house. and some of it happens in the drivers, especially for older APIs like DX11, where there's more driver-side optimization. How can you tell? Well, if you look at things like geometry, how smooth are the objects in the game, the models, how detailed are they? You can look at meshes. So in GTA 5, if you scale the mesh quality, you'll see on top of some cars like Jeeps, we just know, Andrew, the camera guy, just noticed this yesterday, in our Relive versus Shadowplay video. You should go watch that, and you'll see on top of the Jeep there's some headlights, and they're not there on the AMD device, and that's not because we changed the settings, but it's because of a mesh quality tuning feature that AMD has in their drivers we'll talk about later. But the point is, that's part of the mesh quality. So if you were to scale settings back, those types of things would disappear. So in your games, you can look at these really small objects like that, like headlights, or in Black Ops 3, from memory, I remember there was a tank, and you lost some of the roundness of the turret on the tank, because it's not like an actual thing that's used in the game. So you're really not supposed to pay attention to it. But if you stare at it and you change the mesh quality, it'll turn more square as you go. Those types of things impact the performance, because the more primitives you have, the more polys you have, the more tessellation there is, the heavier it's going to hit your GPU. And that's pretty easy to look at and tell. Now, the other things, you could look at, like, how smooth are the shadows, if it's forcing anti-aliasing, stuff like that. Some games force AA. Texture resolution. Some games will go crazy with texture resolutions and do like 4K textures when it's totally unnecessary for something like a chair. So it looks freaking great if you go like prone and stare at the chair leg, but totally unnecessary. So that kind of stuff does eat into VRAM, specifically with texture resolution. And then the rest of it, like geometry, that's really heavy on the shaders. Post-processing stuff kind of happens at the end of the pipeline, as the name would suggest. The rasterization is in there as well. We have a video and article on that. Now, as far as the optimization side of things, it is largely the game developer's job to figure out, how do I make this look good and keep this quality, but not make it kill my computer or my client or my customer's computer, whatever it may be. So what they can do, there's software like Algorithmic, which works. They actually, I think they're represented by the same firm that represents Fmod. If you've seen that logo, it's for audio. But software like that will help developers to do things like build textures that have multiple, basically sample sizes, multiple resolutions that can easily be deployed. So you have really good LOD scaling, level of detail scaling. So what happens is, as they build one texture in effectively an infinite resolution, almost vector-like box, they can save it out, and it can be saved as 16K, 4K, 2K, 256, and all the way down the chart, so that lower-end hardware is better supported. So that's optimization on the game side. You can also do things like cull useless triangles, cull primitives, cull the really anything that's either not going to be seen or appreciated by the player, get rid of it. And that's, again, on the developer side. So that's where optimization comes in. Driver side, the driver developers, which would be the IHVs or NVIDIA and AMD, they go through and they say, the way that this developer is executing this particular effect doesn't work well with our shaders and the way that the architecture is structured around them. And so we are going to change it so that it executes this way. That's how it happens on the driver side. Next question is from Stealth, 2 THs, Stealth1, says, question, what kind of lifespan should people expect with closed loop liquid coolers? I've had a Corsair H100 since 2013. It's been running great. When should I consider replacement? Are there any signs to be on the lookout for, such as pump failure? Originally had this on the 3770K and now on the 6700K. Yeah, so we talked about this briefly in the past as well, but just to refresh everyone, a lot of the Asetek coolers have the lifespan of about 5 years. That's pretty much the industry standard. The new NZXT Kraken coolers have a warranty of 6 years. You can actually expect them to last that long. And basically, though, it's around 5 years plus or minus 1, depending on which supplier and which generation of pump you go with. For signs to look out for, that's the important part. You should probably, if you have, this is what I do, because I'm a little paranoid about liquid coolers, because we've worked with so many. I've seen probably 3 or 4 fail at this point. And it does, they work great. Nothing works better than an AIO if you want something fast, cheap to deploy, and way better than air for the most part. There's some exceptions, but good AIO will be better than decent air or good air even. So when I deploy them, I set up at least something like SpeedFan, but ideally use a bit more advanced software. But SpeedFan at the least is free, and it does check the core temperature. A little inaccurate with AMD. That's just all software at this point. It doesn't necessarily read the AMD temperatures perfectly. Intel works fine. AMD, I need to research still. But generally, you'll at the very least, even with AMD, it is inaccurate in a consistent way. I don't know how much of that is software versus AMD and what they have on their chip for diodes. But the point is it's inaccurate in the same way. And so if you're seeing a temperature even on AMD hardware, that's like, it often reports below ambient for me. So let's say it says the temperature is 20°C. Probably not real, but whatever. Let's say it is. And that's what it says for the entire 3 years you use the cooler. One day it says 40°C. Well, there's a problem. And the thing you can do with a cooler, best thing you do, monitor temperatures occasionally and listen for noise. When it starts making a lot of pump noise, there could be a few things. One, you might have the tubes oriented incorrectly, and check the manual for that. Or two, it could be that the liquid has begun permeating the tubes, and that's just what happens with these. The liquid, it doesn't necessarily evaporate, but it permeates into the rubber, and so the plastic or the rubber tubing over time will pull enough of that liquid out of the actual loop that it starts to lose its performance. The pump has to work in ways that it wasn't designed to work, and you get pump noise, normally gurgling, things like that. And that will happen with some of the, like the Kraken X41 series Asetek coolers, made some of that gurgling on and off throughout life, no matter what, even if they're fine, so don't be too alarmed. But if you hear it a lot, then maybe look into a replacement. You can also touch the tubes near where they connect to the pump, and if they feel hot, it really should not feel hot. If it feels like it's about the same temperature as the backplate of your video card, then it's time for replacement, because that means either one, it's operating way out of spec, you need a better cooler anyway, or two, the pump's just not really working anymore, and it's not pushing the liquid through fast enough to cool down in the radiator. It sits there in the tubes and heats up really fast. So that's what you can look out for. I'm sure there's more things, but that's the short version of it. So as always, Patreon link in the post video if you want to help us out directly. Leave questions in the comment section below. Please upvote and downvote them to help me find the good ones. Ideally, we just use the upvoting system and just push all the good ones to the top, and everyone's happy and everyone gets a thumbs up. But I guess that's not really how YouTube works. So either way, help me out. Push the good ones up. You can tweet at us too with short questions, and subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.